Okay, it says we're live. Hello, everybody, and I'm going to get right to it. So far, it's just Nate and I, and I'm going to, those of you that haven't seen Nate, you're in for a treat. Dragon Lair, I know you've seen him before, and so is Huawei. Maybe Joel, but he's back, and his topic, I never know till he comes on what it is, and it's something very timely, and it's upper respiratory infections or respiratory infections. So, for those that don't know, Nate, he is a herpetologist and he's an educator and he's a snake keeper in that order. So, his links are posted. So, if you're not familiar with him, check him out if you want to learn something about reptiles and snakes. So, Nate, I'll let you have it, sir.
Right
And
on, thank you. So yeah, we're going to talk about a little bit about respiratory infections today. This is a pretty common time of year for people that keep snakes in particular, I'm sure other reptiles as well, to start seeing issues with respiratory infections in some areas of particular, at least in the northern hemisphere. We're going to have a lot of rain coming in for fall and winter. And for some areas, it's going to get really humid. So if you have a more arid climate species that's used to a little bit drier air, that humidity that could be added into the equation could be a little bit of an issue. Out here where I'm at right now, just a little ways outside of Seattle, it is starting to get kind of dry. So that can be a little bit of an issue as well. Not to mention that during winter time, it starts to get pretty cold. So as we get that much colder weather and changes to humidity, it's not uncommon to see animals that start to get respiratory infections. So what I've got here with me today is usually pretty hardy. They can definitely get a respiratory infection, but they're not super duper prone to it. And if they do, they're usually a pretty good candidate for surviving that. This is my Colombian boa ofrenda, formerly boa constrictor imperator, or boa constrictor, and then it got moved to boa constrictor imperator, and now it is just boa imperator, and she is giving me a run for my money as she is really wanting to explore and check everything out in the room.
wow, her patterns reminded me of retic with that white.
Yeah, they have a beautiful pattern. So these guys, the back pattern here, these saddles are a pretty good indication of what you've got there. So with the boa imperators, you're going to see that it's more of these kind of chunkier blocks, and some of them will have a little space right in the center of that saddle marking. Boa constrictor or boa constrictor is going to have typically a narrower one, usually with a central point. It almost looks more like a Batman signal. All right, come on. She's anyway, so respiratory infections, for those that don't know, in snakes are usually a pretty serious issue. As long as you're maintaining the right temperatures, humidity, and keeping everything relatively clean, keeping everything away from each other, especially when you're bringing in new animals. Quarantine is a great way, and we'll go over more of that here in just a bit. It's a great way to prevent respiratory infections. And for snakes in particular, it's a bit of a problem because they don't have the musculature necessary to cough or to expel the mucus that's going to be forming in their lungs and gathering up in there, which can be a real problem. And they basically end up just drowning in it if it's not treated and getting all that nasty stuff out of there. So for us, it wouldn't really be that big of a problem. It would basically just be like a common cold, oftentimes called an upper respiratory infection for humans and other animals that have a little bit more segregation to their body cavity and a little bit more specialization in some of those compartments. With snakes, they don't really have the same kind of connective tissues and things to divide up their body cavity. So everything's just kind of sitting in there. It's one of the many adaptations that they have, to be able to swallow large prey items whole and break those down and retain that in their body. But with respiratory infections, there's a lot of different ways that it can be caused. There are bacterial, fungal, and viral. There's also issues with things like debris in the air, so dust. Even if it could even be caused by things like fungal spores or other kinds of microbes that aren't necessarily starting to grow or take any kind of hold inside the body and the lungs. But just that irritation can be sometimes enough to get a respiratory infection started. It can give bacteria and other nasty little things like that a nice little place to hide. And typically when these guys aren't feeling well, if they're kind of feeling a little sick, they'll go to somewhere warm and dark where they feel like they are secure, where they don't feel like they're able to be seen very well. And if it's warm, that's a bonus. What they're trying to do is stimulate their metabolism and get an immune response going. But if you don't have your temperature set up correctly to adjust for the ambient temperature of the room because of winter time, oftentimes that's how we get temperature related issues with respiratory infections. I was going to bring out my blood python because they are a great bit more sensitive to changes in humidity, to changes in temperature and things like that when it comes to respiratory infections, because they're a much heavier bodied snake comparatively. And so they breathe very deeply, very heavily all the time. And so they are a little bit more, well, they're a good bit more prone to respiratory infections than some other species. Mine has put herself to bed. She is in no mood right now. She just had a big meal earlier this week. So she is sitting in a nice, warm, dark place like she likes to do and digesting that meal and breaking it down. Whereas this gal here had a pretty sizable meal, but it was smaller prey items. And so she's feeling a little bit more active. And you can see that she's trying to reach for stuff in the background here and that's off camera and just kind of giving me a little bit of a hard time because she's just excited to be out. She's excited to be handled.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure being pretty good.
Is the I always ask you these off color questions because I want to know, is the ability or lack of ability to cough and sneeze, is that well, they can sneeze sometimes, can't they?
They do have the ability to kind of exhale quickly. That's how we get things like hissing or chuffing, or some snakes like king cobras and these guys have a little bit more of a growly kind of sound to them when they hiss. So they do have an ability to exhale quickly, but they lack a diaphragm. So when we go to cough, if you ever kind of like put your hand right around the bottom of your rib cage and you can feel that it pulls your stomach in and it pulls up a little bit. And that's your diaphragm moving quickly up to quickly force that air up, because they don't have that same kind of force in the way that their bodies are laid out, because they lay on their stomach like this. They're horizontal to the ground all the time as far as their anatomy goes. They don't have that musculature to kind of pull and kind of hike the lung. For most snakes like colubrids and things like that, it's going to be one lung. I believe it is the right lung that is typically enlarged. With pythons and boas, they have two lungs. They actually have two functional lungs. Typically, I think it's the right lung is going to be usually 75% larger than the other. There you go. Settle down over there. Good Lord. But that lack of that diaphragm and the for a lot of snakes, that having one functioning lung or one primary lung with a secondary smaller lung can lead to issues with any kind of mucosal buildup in those, in that breathing apparatus, not being able to get out. And so now we're looking at things like, swelling in the bronchial tubes and the, they call them alveoles or alveoli. So different structures that are very delicate in the lung that can quite easily be damaged. And that can be quite a problem for these guys. And especially when it goes untreated, especially during winter time, it's a little bit chilly. If your house gets cold and the temperatures in the enclosure aren't that great because the ambient temperature in the room is kind of off from what it normally is, it can lead to reduced, or sometimes, depending on the severity of it, almost non-existent immune response from these guys, which that also will contribute to a lot of health-related issues. And the other things that come with that, things like digestive issues, not being able to properly digest food, break it down, and then pass it all the way through, can also occur as a secondary issue. So it's very important to, during the winter time, make sure that you're checking the ambient temperature of the room, double, triple, quadruple checking, regularly checking all of your temperatures from the basking area, the warmest area of the enclosure, all the way down to the coolest areas where they're supposed to be able to go and retreat to kind of cool off and help thermoregulate. If you notice that your snake has the symptoms of a respiratory infection, which would be deep, heavy, wheezing breathing, especially for snakes that aren't typically heavy breathers. So like if I noticed that she was sounding kind of raspy, or if I felt rattling as she's breathing as I'm holding her, if I see any kind of discharge or bubbling, anything like that, or excessive saliva or mucus production that's just, looks like they're drooling or like they've got stuff coming out of their mouth, that would be a sign that there could potentially be something wrong. And definitely it's one of those things where, depending on the situation, so you may have a situation where your snake just drank water, and if you pick them up and handle them, they may have some of that water come back out of their trachea and come out of their mouth. Because of the mucus and everything that lines the entire, their mouth, their throat, and down into their stomach, it may be a little thick and gloopy. So it's not always necessary to immediately panic, but what you do want to do is immediately start now really paying attention if you notice any kind of discharge like that to, have they been acting normal? Are they still acting normal? Are they breathing heavy? Are they opening their mouth a lot and holding it open and gaping and trying to, do anything to get a nice, full, deep breath? Things like that are some pretty good indicators that something is probably wrong. So definitely one of those things where it's best to have an exotic vet that you know and trust and that you've researched beforehand, so that if you run into that situation, you can, reach out, get an appointment made, get your animal in, have it looked at. You may have to do, if it's, severely advanced, you may have to do things like systemic antibiotics, which is usually going to be an intramuscular injection that you'll have to do at home. The vet will typically teach you how to do that or show you how to do it if you don't already know. And even if you do, they might still give you a crash course just to make sure that you'll be administering those, probably increasing the temperature at least by a little bit in the enclosure, even if your temperatures are pretty optimal and you still have a sick animal, might help to raise up the warm and cool end just a smidge at the very least, to make sure that that animal has plenty of heat that they can go through and have a nice area to kind of hang out and relax in, where it's warm enough to where their body is able to use that energy to get that metabolism going, to get that immune response started up. Come on, do you want to be up or do you want to be over there? Because you can't go over there. There's too much stuff for you to get into. That's delicate stuff too. So definitely, immediately to a vet if you have a situation where, maybe you're able to get an appointment, but it's a ways out and you're really concerned about being able to keep that animal at the very least kind of moving through some sort of immune response to be able to get them to that appointment. You can use a nebulizer technique. Get yourself like a cold mist humidifier or a cool mist humidifier, and I would do a really light one, a solution of F10 cleaner in some water. Distilled water is probably going to work best, just because if you have like tap water that has minerals or anything like that dissolved in it, and you're putting it in one of those cool mist humidifiers that uses the ultrasonic device to break up that water and cause that mist, those minerals can build up in there, and you're already putting something in the water that is potentially going to gum stuff up. So you just want to probably use distilled water and just make sure that it's clean as well. That'll, really help things. You can move them I like to move them to a much smaller enclosure, so that way they're not as tempted to move around as much. Something that they can touch all the sides of at one time, so that way they feel like they're secure. You can put a towel over it if it's like a clear enclosure, like if you've got a really small tank or something, put a blanket or a towel over it to help, one, keep any humidity that you're going to be adding into that small space in there, but also to make it kind of dark. Make sure that they feel like they're, hiding, because they're probably going to be pretty stressed out. They're sick. They don't feel good. They're going to be smelling a lot of weird smells as you're running this humidifier through there. But you can add a little bit of that F10 into there. Usually like a drop or two to a gallon or two of distilled water will work. And then run them on that nebulizer for anywhere from about 10 to 20 minutes. And do that probably a couple of times a week, or every couple of days, until you can actually get to that appointment. See if the vet recommends continuing that treatment or not, in addition to whatever else. They may prescribe antibiotics and have you continue to do that. They may not prescribe antibiotics, but they might advise to continue that treatment of using a nebulized F10. You're going to want to make sure that their enclosure is very clean. That F10 is a cleaner, so you can, kind of double duty it by going through and taking everything out of their enclosure, making it very sterile. If you've got a high humidity species, do something like maybe add some water bottles or something that have moss in it, or some other kind of container that they can't open and get into, or maybe they can move it around, but they're probably not going to beat it up too terribly bad, with some nice damp moss in it to keep that humidity up. And then just occasionally run that F10 mist through there, so that way they can get that into their lungs and help to start clear out any kind of bacteria, viruses, funguses, things like that might be causing that respiratory infection.
What's the ingredient in F10?
I've got a container of it somewhere around. I think it's in the other room. I think it's in the quarantine room. So I would have to go and get that, but it's a veterinary grade level cleaner. That stuff will knock out everything from parvo if you've got dogs to I think there's a lot of invertebrates that'll even kind of not do so good for them. So it might not be great to use in close proximity to your inverts. Maybe check with the breeder or the vet, or do a little bit of additional research if you're going to be cleaning anything for, like if you've got tarantulas, scorpions, things like that. Maybe just give it a cursory double check to make sure. But it works wonders. It will knock out all different kinds of illnesses, bacteria, viruses, funguses, things like that. So using that in a nebulized form to kind of let them breathe that in for a little while, and then let them just, be in their normal enclosure where they have their normal air quality after it's cleaned, and make sure that there's nothing in there that is going to exacerbate the issue or let something retake hold. Go through and inspect all the substrate. If you're seeing different kinds of funguses, if you're seeing mold, mildew, things like that, definitely might be a good idea to start looking into ways to mitigate that. If the humidity is too high all of the time, or if there's just, constant dampness, if there's feces or pieces of shed being left in there that might be harboring that fungal growth or bacterial growth. If that's the case, then a more frequent cleaning schedule might be in order going forward from that point. If it's an issue of bringing in a new animal and not quarantining it, that is a really, really common way for people to get respiratory infections, or going out and being in contact with somebody else's animals. So like if I go to a reptile breeder show or exhibition, when I come home, before I get anywhere near any of my animals, I've got to go take a shower, get a change of clothes, and then I can come in here, check on everyone, do all of that stuff. And I'll usually not handle them until a day or two after, just as a little added precaution. So quarantine, we'll talk about some more preventive actions that you can take. Making sure that your enclosures are clean, making sure that you're following really good hygiene practices, even with like things like their feeders, especially if you have an animal that eats frog, reptiles, anything like that. Going through and making sure that if you're feeding frozen thawed, that particular feeder has been frozen for a month or two, just to make sure that anything that was in there has probably not survived that freezing process, making sure that when you are thawing them out, maybe put them in the fridge the night before, let them kind of gently thaw, then warm them up, and then offer them as a feeder. Making sure that everything that you use to offer food has been wiped down, especially with F10 is a great way to do it. You just have that dilute solution, wipe everything down every time you're done feeding. Even the container, like I use this to just put hot water in or warm water, and then I just put the feeders in there in a bag and let them gently warm up. Yeah, it smells a little bit like food, doesn't it? I know. Not tonight. You can have a small meal next week, maybe a larger one. Why don't you get up over here so everyone can see you? There you go. But just making sure that everything is clean will really help, especially in the enclosure though. So if you've got like a high humidity species, using certain substrates like aspen has a tendency to mold very quickly, very easily, and it gets really moldy really quick. So if you're using something like that for a species that requires that high humidity, and you keep having this repeat issue where like you've got a, say like a ball python, and it needs that higher humidity in the 50 to 60% range, and it's just a constant fight with the substrate, using something like aspen with it's constantly molding or mildewing, you're getting a lot of fungal growth and just really struggling with it. Maybe consider switching over to something like cocoa based substrates that are a little bit more resistant to things like molds and mildews, or other funguses, and even bacterial growth. They're pretty good about resisting stuff like that too. Go through, and even if you're not doing necessarily a deep clean where you're removing all of your substrate, just going through and tilling it up as you're going through and doing your spot cleaning. Take the snake out. If they need to be in a different enclosure while you're doing it, you can set them off to the side in a little, basically a snake version of a playpen. If they'll behave themselves, sometimes she will, and I can just have her on my shoulders as I'm cleaning. But you can do that as well, especially if there's nothing that they can get into, break or damage or do any harm with near the enclosure. Then you can just have them hanging out with you as you're going through and just cleaning, till up the substrate that's in there, picking up any and all feces, urates, pieces of shed that may have been missed. They can bury them on accident pretty easily. Once in a great while, I like to try to do it monthly when I can, and go through and do a deep clean of the enclosure where all of the substrate comes out, everything comes out, gets wiped down and cleaned. A good day-to-day cleaner that's relatively cheap and easy to get is white vinegar with just water. I like to do a 2 parts water to 1 part vinegar solution. Works out really well, gets things nice and clean. You do have to let it kind of breathe a little bit to get that vinegar smell to air out, but usually it works out pretty well. And you can use that. You can get white vinegar at grocery stores, Walmart, Safeway, Albertsons, Kroger, any of those kinds of places you can get that stuff. So that's pretty easy to get. whereas F10 might be a little bit more difficult. I know that Amazon won't ship it to certain areas or certain states or certain cities, things like that. So that might be a little bit more of a challenge. But quarantine is also going to be really important if you're someone that is in that process of building up a bit of a menagerie of animals where you've got new stuff coming in, or if you're a breeder, especially just starting out. I'm sure that experienced breeders would already know to do this, but especially for people that are just starting out, either keeping reptiles or exotic animals of any kind, really, or any other animals. You take your new animal, you set it away from everybody else, you have a nice sterile environment for them to exist in that's providing everything that they need as far as temperature, humidity, coverage, so they feel nice and secure. But you want to use things like paper towels or butcher's paper, things like that, so that way you can observe the feces that's coming out of that animal, make sure that there's no parasites. You'll be able to see on that kind of substrate if you're using it temporarily for the first couple of weeks of quarantine, any discharge that's coming out of that animal. So if there's anything weird going on the backside, you'll be able to see it. If they've got stuff coming out of their mouth, you'll be able to see it a little easier. If they've got any kind of cuts or abrasions or any other kind of injuries like that that might be bleeding, that would make that easier to see. And then you run them through a quarantine period of, I like to do a couple of months at least before I move them all into the same area. And in that period, once I'm fairly certain that that animal is healthy and clean and doesn't have anything, bizarre or potentially harmful going on, I'll kind of do little introductions where I'll bring that animal into the room where everybody else is, hang out there for a little bit. Then they'll go back, spend the rest of their time in their normal enclosure, and just kind of slowly introduce them that way. So that way, if there is something that's going on where maybe these guys have all built up some kind of immunity or resistance to a particular kind of bacteria, virus, or fungus or something like that, that other animal is able to just get little tiny bits of that to start getting a little bit more of an immune response going for themselves. And if things kind of go awry when they're in a separate area, you'll be able to deal with that a little bit more effectively without having it sweep across everything that you own.
Oh, yeah.
So quarantine is really important. There's a lot of people that I see that don't quarantine, or they don't quarantine for very long, and they end up with all sorts of things from mites to all different number of communicable diseases and sicknesses and things like that. And it's terrible. Things like a respiratory infection are very infectious. They will spread super quickly. You can have, a room full of 20 animals. One of them gets a respiratory infection, and in a week's time, 3/4 to 100% of all your animals could potentially get that respiratory infection, just depending on kind of how everyone's individual biology is working out, their own individual homeostasis of being able to keep internal functions going and happy and healthy. But respiratory infections are definitely not something to take lightly. They're not something to kind of put off on the back burner. If you suspect that an animal has a respiratory infection, it's definitely time to really observe that animal. Not to the point where you're pestering them and stressing them out, but definitely enough to where you can start seeing subtle differences in their normal behavior. If you have an animal that's typically very outgoing and very bespoke, and it's just kind of out and about all the time, and all of a sudden they're hiding, they're more nervous, things like that, it's a good time to start really paying attention to what's going on and seeing if you can figure out what's causing that change in behavior, or if you're seeing other symptoms or hearing symptoms. Definitely observation until you're able to be pretty sure, and until you're able to get a vet appointment just to have them checked out. Can be expensive, but when it comes down to it, you're responsible for your animals. You've got to make sure that their needs are met, and so it's important to be able to provide that for them. Right. So if you suspect that you've got one, call a vet, get an appointment set up, do observations until that appointment, and then follow the directions that are given by your veterinarian. And let the veterinarian know, if things aren't getting better after a certain amount of time, if, you'll have that discussion with them, ask lots of questions, get as much information as you can, write it down, record it to a voice thing on your phone if you can. Anything that will help you remember all of the information that you're given by the veterinarian. If you've got situations where, you have a really high humidity species and the vet says to drop their humidity for an extended period of time, if that's not something that you're comfortable with doing, or if you're unsure about it, get a second opinion. Go to another vet, ask other keepers, see if anyone else has had any experience with that, see what they've done or what their vet has recommended. And then, you can go back to your vet and let them know, like, hey, I got a second opinion, or I went with this. Is there any particular reason that you wanted me to drop that humidity that much for that long? And they might be able to provide a little bit more information from that point. Come on.
How do you, so how would you balance ventilation? We know how important it is to have good ventilation for the reptiles, but when you have a respiratory infection, you're just throwing that around the room.
Yeah, so ventilation is a huge component of your enclosure. It's going to depend a lot on the materials that your enclosure is made out of, the substrate that you use, and how that particular enclosure is set up. If you've got something like PVC or other plastics or other solid materials that have a tendency to really hold humidity in really well, if you have the ability to do something where you can put the ventilation on the front of the enclosure, it's great. So if you're making your own enclosure, or if you're having one built for you by a friend, or if you are handy enough or know someone that's handy enough to be able to put additional ventilation in the front of your enclosure, then you'll have a little bit of an easier time accessing it and being able to control it. If your ventilation's only all in the back, it's going to be a little bit more difficult depending on how you set the room up. But that's just something to be aware of. If your ventilation's on one particular side of the enclosure, it would probably be best to make sure that that side of the enclosure is accessible. You can also use things like fans. So those will work out really well for drier climate species where you need that humidity to be down. You can equip your enclosure with small, like, computer exhaust fans, and that will help circulate air through, which will keep humidity roughly where it's supposed to be, depending on how you have your fan set up. If you've got higher humidity requirements for things like a blood python or more tropical species like this little gal here, you can opt to go with less ventilation or more specific ventilation sizes. If you have fans on the enclosure just for air circulation, even for high humidity species, you can do things like you get adjustable or variable speed fans to kind of help regulate how fast or how much work that fan is putting in, how much air it's moving. You can do things like adding a cool mist humidifier to the enclosure that feeds the humidity in. You can also get things like a, what do they call that? A hygrostat, which is like a thermostat, but it's for humidity. I've got one where we have 2 ports on it for power. I believe they call them works, and work 1 is usually like the humidity for this particular one, and work 2 is a fan. So it has a little probe, just like it would be on a hygrostat or a hygrometer that would measure the humidity, and it'll take constant readings from where it's at in the enclosure of how much humidity is in there. And then you have little set things on there where, if it gets to 65%, you can have it turn on a fan to bring it back down to a range between like 50 and 60% or something to that effect. There's ones that are a little bit more advanced that have more advanced settings on there that you can kind of toggle a little bit more. and adjust and have it be a little bit more customized. But there's cheap ones that you can get on Amazon that work just fine. And I believe they're mostly meant for like growing mushrooms and even what do they call those, like humidors or something for like cigars and things.
Yeah.
So you can do things like that. Substrate is another way that you can control humidity. If you have a substrate that needs to be dry and that's constantly dry, but the animal needs more humidity, you can switch to a substrate that's a little bit less prone to problems with having more moisture. So like cocoa, you can use it dry or with a little bit more hydration to it and kind of get a good result out of it. If you've got something that needs a little bit of a drier climate to it, you just have to be kind of careful with filling and dealing with your water in the enclosure. If you've got a moisture retaining substrate that you keep dry in that enclosure. So like if you've got, like my Great Basin gopher snakes are on a dry cocoa husk. Whenever I go in there to refill their water, I've got to be a little bit more accurate with where I'm pouring the water and usually open the entire enclosure up to be able to get in there and pour that water specifically into the bowl, because any water that gets outside of that and that makes contact with that substrate is going to get absorbed and slowly released as humidity. So when they're going through their sheds and things like that, super easy. Just go through and give it a really light misting and just kind of keep an eye on it throughout the week. And then once they are done with that shed, I don't have to mist it anymore, because they in particular can function at the ambient humidity that we've got going on here at just about any given point in time of the year. So if you've got species that are more sensitive to it, things like blood pythons, ball pythons are kind of sensitive to that kind of stuff. There's all different kinds of devices and ways that you can really specifically control that humidity to make sure that it's not too high, too low. And with those hygrostats, you get a nice automated system where if you've got a misting system on it, or if you've got a cool mist humidifier, it'll regulate itself. It'll keep it within the range that it's set to, which is really nice.
I recently, totally off topic, but I about 2 weeks ago lost my Brazilian rainbow boa and just sick over it. I'd had her 2 years and talked about it a little bit on here, and people seem to think that she might have aged out on me, and that's a good possibility. But I got her from a big online store a couple years ago, and of course she came with worms and mites and all that stuff. But she was doing great. In fact, she grew several inches. But I don't know. Because
Yeah, I mean they're a great example of a more sensitive species that they really need that good balance for a nice, healthy, long-lived animal to. You've got to have a very well ventilated enclosure that stays humid. So that would be an animal that I would advise people to use something like a cool mist humidifier and a hygrostat for. Blood pythons as well, even depending on the specific kind of setup that you're using, like for a boa constrictor or boa imperator, that kind of setup can help ease the burden of going through and misting the enclosure, checking the humidity, doing things like that. Then you can still have your regular hygrometer, thermometer kits set up all across the enclosure, so you know what humidity ranges you're getting, along with your temperature ranges. So you can have hot, drier areas. You can set up cooler, humid areas or warmer, humid areas, and just have more of those spaces where, depending on what they want, they can go there and get comfortable.
I'm not sure what happened with her. She would go through phases of not wanting to eat, but when she did eat, she was really good at it and wanted to eat every week. But I kept her about every 10 days to 2 weeks. And she would lose weight, then gain weight. I took in several stool specimens, um, and the vet had wormed her right after I first got her, so she didn't have any worms. So I hated it, but I got her from a place that sells a lot of reptiles, and they were selling a group of these, but they were wild caught. But somebody thought maybe they had kept them as breeders for a while, and so maybe she was an older snake. That I don't know.
Yeah, that's a possibility, and that is something that some older snakes will do, is they kind of get into that um, inconsistent feeding, inconsistent weight control, things like that. And with those guys, they're really high iridescence, so it can be a little bit on the difficult side to kind of tell, like, are they getting just kind of dull and the snake equivalent of like gray hairs and things like that, or is she getting ready to shed, or is it just general, is she covered in some kind of dust or something from her enclosure? It's really tough with snakes to tell how old they are unless you have been able to verify when they were hatched or born,
Right.
and how long you've had them and things like that. And it can be a real pain. I get asked a lot of the time by people when working with wild snakes, so can you tell how old they are? And not really. You can get a pretty general idea based off of abundance of food in the area. If you kind of have any background on weather patterns in the area, and so like how long their active season is going to be, what they're going to be eating, so the quality of food, and just the general idea of when they're reproducing and when they should be hatching out or being born and separating from their parents and things like that, or if they're like a rattlesnake or something, that'll stay with the parents for a little bit, or if they're just one where parent makes a nest, drops eggs, and then gets out of there. Situations like that, those can be really tough to age out and figure to estimate an age on. So I can only imagine with something like a snake that's a little bit on the bigger side, where they've still probably got a couple inches to go before they reach their typical max size. It's a nightmare.
Well, Sam, one of the moderators, has 3 questions, and probably the most important one to him. And he says, probably discussed this on a previous live stream, but what is that mass sculpture above his cabinets?
So this is a like a hand carved wooden Aztec warrior's mask replica. My grandfather used to go to Mexico quite a bit when I was really young, and he would vacation there and bring back all different kinds of really cool souvenirs. So I've got things like this guy up here. Somewhere I think I still have a replica obsidian dagger that has like a flute for the handle. I don't know if that was like an actual thing that they did, but it was just cool little trinkets like that would get brought back. So I've got quite the collection of oddities and other strange things. Like you can see the anatomical skeleton stuff behind me, and then the mask there. I've got different taxidermy pieces and things like that, including some that I've done. I've actually got a scorpion that I did right here next to me. So that was a pet scorpion of mine that sadly passed away, and so I took the time to preserve them and put them in a nice little cloche here that needs to be dusted and cleaned up.
Cool.
But love me some oddities, so I've got them all over the place.
Are you aware of that, or familiar with the Oddities and Curiosities show that travels around? Like it'll be in Atlanta twice a year, different parts of the country, and they've had a couple in Australia now.
Oh, nice. I just recently heard about them. I unfortunately have not gone myself yet, but am planning to probably on the next one that comes through my area. I don't know if it's the same circuit as if it's like an international one, or if they're a little bit more local or smaller, but definitely something that I would love to go to. And the next one, I hope to be able to get either time off of work to go to, or just clear some time on the schedule so I can go.
It's really amazing. There's so many cool things, and the taxidermy stuff is really impressive. So much stuff. Let's see. Next question from Huawei says, "Do you have to worry about mold?" I don't know if that means, do you have mold or do you need to worry about it?
It's definitely something to be concerned about at all times. Not necessarily to the point of panic, but just something that it should be something that you're aware of and plan to avoid. So things like substrate is typically the thing that I usually see mold or mildew issues with and complications from. But it can also come from even like if you've got bioactive enclosures. It's really important to make sure that there's something in that enclosure that cleans that up. Things like isopods, springtails, basically any other kind of detritivore that's going to go through there and start breaking down that kind of material. So that way there's a little bit more balance in that little miniature ecosystem that you're building. If you're doing something where it's a more naturalistic but not bioactive, so you've got things like fake plants in there, I prefer to go with plastic. I find that they oftentimes don't hold up quite as well to UV in the enclosure, which is a bummer. And I do have to replace stuff with some degree of frequency, just because that UV will break the plastic down, make it brittle, it'll start to break. So if I notice that anything is starting to break off, the first sign that something breaks, I got to pull it out of there and replace it with something different. But fabric plants just harbor that bacteria and mold and things like that. So doing things like making sure that you've got an appropriate substrate, appropriate decorations. If you're using woods, try to match and it takes a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of research. But certain kinds of woods hold up better in high humidity. So like cork does pretty good with high humidity. Grape wood it's middling. It's not super terrible about it, but it can mold and it will. Aspen is terrible in high humidity. It'll mold whether it's the substrate, you've got the shavings, or even just branches. Pine, you have to use kiln dried, so that can be a bit of a pain. That has a bit of a tendency to mold. So things like that are definitely kind of what you can do to prevent mold buildup or mold growth. And then just keeping things like feces under control, shed pieces of skin, especially if you have things like lizards or something. You want to get those removed so that way you want to try to keep the amount of organic material that's in there that could harbor and feed and propagate mold as down as you possibly can. And there's all different kinds of like mosses and things like that you can use to help keep humidity up that are resistant to molds. But there's also ones that you can use to help pull moisture out of the air that will mold quickly, but that would work well for like a more arid, a more arid climate species where you want that humidity to stay down.
Patrick said, I need to up my game on cleaning sheds out. I'm confessing right here because I think they're cool. And I leave them in there sometimes like a week till the next cleaning, but I need to stop doing that. And some of the tanks are bioactive anyway, so they're great food for the isopods, but most of mine are not.
Yeah, if you've got like an bioactive setup and you miss a couple of really small patches, that's fine. It's something that they'll break down and pick up. But if you've got just several sheds worth of sheds sitting in that enclosure for months and months and months at a time, that's when, if there's nothing there that's quickly breaking it down and moving that material through the energy cycling process of decay, breakdown, and things like that, that's when you'll end up with mold coming in and being like, that's something nice and tasty for me to start growing on and breaking down myself. Nobody else is getting after it. I will.
Good point. Patrick says, Dragon Lair says that's a beautiful boa, and is it a BCI? He missed the start.
Yeah, this is, and thank you. She's a very pretty lady. Come here, baby. This is my Colombian boa imperator. This is Ofrenda. I have had her she is about 6 or 7 years. She's 6, I think. 6 years old. Got her on a nice lean diet so that way she's not getting too big too quickly and not getting chubby. So she's got a nice, consistent, relatively slow growth for me. She has gotten huge. She used to fit quite comfortably in the palm of my hand, and now it gets to be a little bit of a challenge to handle her even with two hands, because these guys are they're a big snake, but they're not a gargantuan or giant snake.
How big will she get?
They can. There have been some that have reached up to the 10 and above mark. Really, really, really large females. More often than not, they're going to reach around, like males are probably going to slow down and cap off about 6 or 7 feet. Females are usually between 6 and 8 feet, with a couple of really good sized ones getting to 8.5 or maybe 9 feet is a real good size for one of these guys. At present, I think she's got to be about just short of 5 foot, if not 5 foot.
Yeah, she looks like she's every bit that. He says she's got a very good color and beautiful pattern.
Yeah, she is a stunner. And my niece, this is her favorite snake of all time.
And see why.
Yeah, she's so gentle. She's so sweet. And my niece really bad wanted to see a snake, so I brought her out. And immediately they were rubbing on each other, and my niece gives her little kisses, and she loves when she gets a tongue flick across the arm, and she starts giggling and says that it tickles. She wants to hold her, she wants to see her, she's so gentle with her. So Ofrenda, of course, is more than happy to hang out with her because she gets all the attention.
He says he knows someone, Tom Crutchfield, that has a 12-foot one, but it's really old.
Yeah, yeah. These guys, as long as you don't power feed them, they usually live a pretty long time. 20 years is pretty normal for a good healthy one. Some of them I've heard have gotten to 40. So if you can keep these guys nice and healthy, keep them active, keep them enriched, keep their diet really varied and healthy. She just got frog for the first time not too long ago, and she was kind of weirded out by that. But give them a varied diet, give them some good enrichment as far as like having time outside of the enclosure, having stuff to do in their enclosure that will help keep their muscles and bones nice and healthy. Give them things like organ meat once in a while, or chicken feet, things like that, to help with their own organ health. And these guys will live for a long time, and the longer they live, the bigger they get. It's just some people tend to feed them very heavily, very quickly, and they do that for a long time to get this explosive growth out of the animal. And there is a way that you can get a quicker growth rate out of them to get a pretty big animal pretty quickly. But you have to be really, really careful with it, because they are very prone to obesity, which will cause all that fat buildup inside their body cavity, which constricts the organs. The same thing that it does to humans. It causes all different kinds of horrid health problems for them. And these guys make such wonderful, wonderful companions, in my opinion, that I want her to live the longest that I can possibly have her live. I would happily have her be a 12-foot gargantuan snake as I'm 60, 70 years old, sitting on my couch with her, just hanging out like it's a dog, because she is, you can see that she's moving around. She's very active, but she tends to move pretty slowly. She's very affectionate. She loves to meet new people. She used to not be a big fan of kids, but ever since she has met my niece and had good interactions with them, and the same way that you get kids interested in reptiles, you can get reptiles interested in kids. Where you just have a couple of good interactions where nothing scary or bad happens, and they form these really cool bonds, to the point where I'm pretty sure that she recognizes my niece now, because she doesn't have any head shyness with her. My niece can, touch her chin. She's touched the top of her head. She's touched her lips, which makes my mom panic. She's always like, oh, why does it have to be that one? The biggest freaking snake that you've got, man. And I'm like, it's fine. It's like a dog, we're going to pay attention. We're going to be careful. If I see that there's anything going wrong, we're going to get it dialed in. You know, she's being both of them are being gentle with each other. They're both doing great. You know, if you panic, one of them is going to panic, and that's going to be where we get a problem. Come up with the other side.
Let's see. Dragon Lair said he thought that snake was like 30 years old, and also he added, quick growth can cause fatty liver disease. If you knew how infrequently wild snakes get to eat, I bet.
Yeah.
You would feed a big meal very infrequently.
Yeah. Yeah, there's ways that you can do it with like leaner meals more frequently and then kind of sprinkle in a heavier meal. And doesn't necessarily always come down to the size of the feeder, but the content of the feeder. So like she gets a lot of rodents. That's a big part of her diet, but she gets those at a more infrequent schedule. So if I give her several small rodents, she either will then be switched over to birds for a while to kind of help balance that out, let her break down and use all of the energy that she's getting from mammalian prey. If I were giving her reptiles, I would probably give that even more frequently. So like when she got frog, she got a pretty sizable chunk because it's a very, very lean protein. And it was only protein and calcium because it was frog legs. So you can do things like that where you will get not necessarily, it's not going to give you the same kind of growth ratios or growth speed that you're going to see from just straight up power feeding. But there is a way to kind of assist with high quality feeders and certain kinds of feeding schedules where you frequently for a little bit of really good, high quality, healthy foods, but then you back off for a little while and do the same, high quality, good feeders, but you do it less frequently. So that way they can kind of have a more naturalistic setup as far as how things might be in the wild. Some seasons you're going to be able to sit there and pig out and have as much as you can possibly have. You're going to be fat and happy and content. And then the next couple of months might be a little bit rough where, you've kind of eaten everybody out of house and home. And so now you've got to chill for a little while and let stuff replenish. Right. So doing things like that would be a better way to do it. I don't like to power feed at all. I would rather have my animals grow normally and more consistently and have better development of bones, muscles, organs, skin, scales, the whole 9 yards, than to have them balloon up on me and have like, oh yeah, I've got this huge snake, but it's only going to live 15 to 20 years because I sat there and fed it huge fatty meals all the time and didn't let it digest. And just not for me. I'd like to have these guys for a very long time because they're a good time, so I like to have them as long as I possibly can and try to keep them active and healthy and doing the things that they love to do because I love to interact with them and they seem to enjoy interacting with me. I know for certain that she does because she will make a huge fuss about going back into her enclosure. Coming out, she's usually not super, super keen on unless she thinks she's going to get some kind of food or unless there's another person in the room. And then she's like, oh, there's new people and I get to come out. So I'll just go ahead and start chugging my way up to whomever. And she doesn't quite understand that people are terrified of her because she's large and intimidating. So she'll get right up in somebody's face thinking that she's going to make a new friend the whole time they're soiling themselves and ready to panic.
Yeah. I've got a couple of ball pythons, big females like that, and I usually stream with them around my neck, or one of them, but I haven't lately. Patrick says that he recently had a clutch of carpet pythons, palpuan, I can't say the word, P-A-P-U-A.
Oh, poplins, nice.
Poplins, yes. And he said that he's gone to feeding birds to them, and they get rats about every fifth feeding. He can get the large quail cheaper than large rats too.
Oh, nice. I need to continue to look into sources for quail. Currently, I've gotten most of my stuff from Rodent Pro, and it's been, relatively affordable. It's more expensive than the rodents there. But when I went to source quail locally, those were more expensive than buying them in bulk, ready to go into the freezer, all of that. And I jokingly said that I might start breeding quail. And if I ever have enough space for it, it's definitely something that I probably would do. They're, relatively not a difficult animal from what I've seen and done my research on. They don't take up a whole lot of space. They're pretty prolific breeders, and they make fantastic feeders. I get really good results out of giving these guys quail. Most of them like them. My false water cobra Carita, she goes ballistic for them. She really likes her some little baby birds.
I for my birthday, which was last week, I got myself a bunch of from an online store. I got myself a bunch of, because things were like half off and stuff, the Black Friday and stuff. But I got two big boxes. I got a bunch of couple hundred pinkies and some small mice, some big mice, some extra large rats for my carpet python, and some quail. So I got quite a deal on all that. That'll last me for a few months.
Right on.
Nice to be able to go outside the area, and get something different. And
yeah, I usually do my orders from like Rodent Pro and stuff once a year. This year, before I place an order, I'm gonna check out, I think it's called Carnivore Cafe, I think is the website. I'll ask, but it's my friend orders from them, and he seems to like their product and their pricing. So I'm gonna check what his recommendation is, where he goes through and see if which one's better, and then put my order in. And if I end up going away from Rodent Pro, then we will see what shows up with the other place.
yeah, it was Rodent Pro, and I'd used them a couple times before. One time just for the extra small quail, and I think I wouldn't get those anymore because the little heads tend to pop off with any kind of bite at all. So then you're having to find something for the head. That's kind of gross, but
yeah,
that's snake keeping. But hey, June, thank you for the super chat. That's mighty generous of you. Appreciate you.
Yeah, if you've got colubrids, they're usually pretty good about just going and picking up food. So if you've got heads that are just kind of loose in the bag, things like corn snakes, my false water cobra, she'll readily pick stuff up on her own. I can just lay stuff in her enclosure and walk away and come back after 15, 20 minutes, and she'll have woken up enough to, oh, somebody put something in here that smells good, and she'll take them, usually pretty gently, but sometimes she's a little bit of a lunatic.
Well, it turns out that my San Diego prairie snake loves them. So I save them for him and give him like 4 as a chick. So
yeah, it's a good way to keep him going.
Does anybody? I just remembered Nate worked all day today and rushed home to be with us, and we've been going a little over an hour. So I don't want to abuse his good willingness to talk about snakes, but I could go for 3 or 4 hours, no problem. But we won't do that. We won't ask him to do that. Does anybody have any questions or final comments or anything? I'm sure he has things to do. Anything, anybody? Thank you again, Jen. That was mighty sweet of you to do that. You didn't. I always donate my money that I get to the art, so thank you. Appreciate that. I've looked into raising quail, but you have incubated the eggs as they won't set.
Yeah, I tried feeding mine quail eggs, and nobody has had any interest in eating them. They will push them around the enclosures. They'll smell them. They'll check them out. But when it comes to eating them, they just kind of stare at it like, it's a really interesting decoration that you've put in here. I'm going to leave it right where it's at. And then they walk away from it, but they move away from it. So they don't really ever eat them. I've even tried cracking them. I think 2 or 3 times now I've tried scenting them. Just nobody has any interest in eating them, so I've kind of given up on trying to feed quail eggs.
You guys are getting silly in the chat now. And I'm Trash Cat. That was directed at me. They know me too well. Is it is it acceptable to not wear pants as an adult? I don't know if that's directed at me or the parrot, but no, I'm wearing my big old boxer shorts. Nobody cares in a t-shirt, so what am I
I
going
mean,
to
as long as you keep the camera,
say?
up at chest level and above.
Well, like 5 years ago, I was filming a fish tank, and one of course, Pam saw my boxer shorts and put everybody on blast about it. So Bob said, "Any questions?" Thank you, Trash Cat. I don't care if it's appropriate or not, Dragon Lair said. I hardly ever wear pants. Okay, and with that, we will say thank you and thank you, moderators, and thanks. I like yoga pants. Yeah, yeah, I've gotten a little big for mine, but yeah, I do too. Guys, don't forget to check out Nate's channels. He's on YouTube, he's on Instagram, and he's on TikTok. And I follow him on all three. So
Yeah, here pretty soon I'm going to start working on more YouTube content. Right now, I think it's a couple of re-uploads from my TikTok. But here in the next couple of months, that's going to become more of a focus of, especially with the potential for TikTok to be going out and making its way to the dodo. I'm probably going to refocus more of the effort on doing YouTube videos. So probably about like 10-15 minute videos. So that'll take a little bit of time to get that started up with writing them, filming, editing, and then getting them posted. So that should be, that's going to be kind of the focus of 2025 is to get the YouTube channel a little bit more robust.
cool. Let's see, there were two things. Oh, Trash Cat, one of the mods says, "Thank you, Nate. Always a learning experience."
Yeah,
And
thank you guys for having me. I'm always glad to come on when I'm able to and chitty chat about whatever odd little subject we can come up with and try to make sure that people have access to information. I know that research can be tough. It's always good to do multiple sources, and that's part of the reason is that there's a lot of information out there, but not all of it is correct, and not all of it applies to every single individual situation. So it's important to do multi steps. So I am more than happy to be another point of reference for people that want to get into keeping these beautiful animals.
and one last question, but before I ask that one, and I forgot to mention, Nate recently, several months ago, got, I forget the certification, Nate. Will you tell us again?
Yeah, so I did some study at the Amphibian Foundation in Atlanta, Georgia, and I am now a master herpetologist.
Yep. And that means a lot to these guys because being a master fish breeder and stuff, is, some of us have done that. Not me, but some people have done that. So, and all right, June wants to know, does Nate have any other reptiles?
Just snakes. So I have 7 snakes across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 species. So 7 snakes, 5 species. Had to do a little head count there. I was like, good gracious, how many species are we up to now? But yeah, my snakes range all over from all over the world. I have 2 different kinds of Central and South American. So she's a little bit closer to Central American. My false water cobra would be South American. I have East Asian with the blood python, North American with my Pituophis catenifer deserticola, which is the Great Basin gopher snakes, and then West Africa with the ball python.
Awesome. I caught the parrot chewing on my shirt here, and it's not one that I want the parrot to chew on. So he's a bad boy. Okay. Thank you so much, Nate. I'll see you around on the internet for sure. But he comes back every few months. Every time I ask him, he comes back. So people are really talking and bragging about what a good guest you've been. And wow.
Yeah, I'm super grateful to be on here. I'm glad that everyone enjoys it. And if you guys ever have any questions, if you see me on TikTok, if you see me on Instagram or something like that, and you've got a question, send me a message or a comment, and I'll reach out and see if we can get something figured out for you.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks to her for being so patient. She probably enjoyed you holding her all this time.